Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the rough wooden post, her father's voice echoing in the frigid air. $40, he called, his words like knives, for damaged goods. Her eyes flickered to the crowd gathered in the town square, faces turned away, judgment clear in every whisper. She was nothing but a bargain now. Her heart pounded, the cold air biting through her thin dress, but her gaze stayed locked on her father's. The man who had been her protector once, before the whiskey, before the gambling, before the debts. Now he was the one selling her off like she was nothing but a piece of property, her worth determined by the men who had coins to spare. She flinched when a voice rang out through the crowd, cutting through the tense silence. $40 is too much for a broken girl, Silas Cobb jeered, his eyes gleaming with malice. His words scraped across her skin, and she looked away, trying to ignore the way he looked at her like she was some animal at a stockyard. 40 is fine, her father spat, his eyes hard. Take it or leave it. Quote. Clara swallowed the bile rising in her throat. No one cared. Not the men in the crowd, not even the women who dared to whisper behind their hands. The shame that hung over her, thicker than the cold mountain air, suffocated her. She wasn't a person to them, she was just damaged goods, a price to be haggled over. But then, just as she felt her knees buckle, something shifted in the crowd. A man walked forward, his coat worn but sturdy, his boots crunching the frost beneath him with a steady rhythm. He stood taller than the rest, his movements deliberate and calm. Clara's breath caught in her chest as his eyes found hers. There was no pity in them, only something else, something she couldn't quite place. "You want her," the man said, his voice deep and steady, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "You'll have to pay more than that." The crowd fell silent, a ripple of confusion running through the onlookers. No one had ever dared speak like that to her father before. Her heart raced, and for the first time in days, something other than fear sparked inside her, a flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain. Could this man be different? Could he see her for who she really was? Her father scowled. "You don't know what you're talking about. This girl's trouble, a mistake. She's not worth more than 40. The stranger's gaze didn't waver as he locked eyes with Clara. For a moment, the world seemed to stop moving. The snow fell slower, the whispers quieter. All she could hear was the thundering of her own pulse in her ears. "She's worth more than that," the man said simply. "And I'll pay 60. The words hung in the air, and Clara's breath caught. She looked at her father's face, saw the surprise there, the moment of hesitation before he grunted in disbelief. $60, her father repeated, his voice filled with disgust, as if the money couldn't make up for the stain on his pride. "You'd pay 60 for her? For this?" Quote. The man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. "I would, and I'll take her home with me." Quote. The crowd murmured again, but Clara's world had tilted. She wasn't sure if this man was some kind of fool or her last chance at salvation, but she had no time to decide. Before her father could protest, the stranger stepped forward and handed him the money, taking Clara's arm in a steady grip. She didn't pull away. She didn't know how to. There was something in the way this man held her, something that felt like safety, like a promise that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the world alone anymore. As he led her away from the crowd, Clara's heart beat wildly in her chest. The man's hand remained on her arm, firm but not possessive, guiding her through the sea of onlookers, who stared with open mouths and raised eyebrows. "Come on," the stranger said softly, his voice rough but kind. "It's time to go home." Quote. Clara didn't know if she was walking toward salvation or deeper into a trap. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, someone had chosen her, not because of her father's money, not because of her shame, but because of something she couldn't quite understand. And as the stranger led her away from the market square, she dared to hope for the first time in a long while. The ride to the cabin was quiet, the snow beneath Bessie's hooves crunching softly as they made their way along the mountain path. Clara sat stiffly, her hands clutching the sides of the saddle, feeling the cold seep into her bones, but not as deeply as the weight in her chest. She didn't speak, and neither did the man beside her. His presence was solid and reassuring, but also unfamiliar. His silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something that left room for her thoughts to settle. His coat flapped lightly in the wind, the only sign of movement as the world around them stood still in the winter hush. Clara had never seen a man like him. The way he'd stood up to her father, the way he'd looked at her without pity or shame, was something she had never expected. There was a quiet strength in him, an unspoken promise that he wouldn't hurt her. That thought, a fragile hope, felt like it might break if she focused on it too long. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His face was weathered by years of hard work, his jaw set with determination, yet there was something kind in his eyes, something real. She wondered if he could hear the same voices that had followed her for years, voices that told her she was worthless, broken. It felt impossible to imagine that he couldn't. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. Her voice was rough, worn from days of silence and fear. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he urged Bessie forward, the mare picking her way carefully through the snow. "What did you expect?" His voice was calm, steady. "I don't know." Clara swallowed, the words catching in her throat. She hadn't expected kindness, certainly not from someone like him. She'd been sold like an animal after all. Who would choose her after that? The man's eyes flickered to her, and for a moment there was something in his gaze, a flicker of understanding. But it was gone too quickly for her to hold on to. "My name's Eli," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur in the wind. "Elijah Brooks, but you can call me Eli." Clara nodded, unsure what to say. She didn't know this man. She didn't know anything about him, except that he had paid her father's price and had taken her from the crowd of people who had looked at her like she was a commodity. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the wind. "You don't owe me anything." Quote, Eli didn't respond immediately, but she felt the tension in his shoulders as if he was holding something back. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice steady but tinged with something softer. "No one should owe anyone that kind of thing. Not you. Not anyone." She didn't know how to respond to that. She had never thought of herself as deserving of kindness, not after what had happened to her. Not after how her own father had discarded her. They rode in silence for a while, the cold biting at their faces, the world a blur of white. But Clara could feel the warmth growing between them, fragile as it was. She wasn't sure if it was the fire inside the cabin that she could almost feel, or if it was something else entirely, something in the way Eli had stood up for her. The cabin came into view after a while, nestled in a small clearing at the edge of the mountain, smoke curling from the chimney in a steady stream. The sight of it caught Clara off guard. It was small, simple, and yet it looked like a place where something real could grow, something that had nothing to do with her past. "This is it," Eli said, slowing Bessie's pace as they approached the cabin. He helped her dismount carefully, steadying her as she slid from the saddle. The cold air hit her all at once, but it wasn't as sharp here. The wind seemed to quiet the closer they got to the cabin, and she could smell the wood smoke in the air, the smell of a home she hadn't known in a long time. "You can go inside," Eli said, his voice softer now. "I'll make a fire, get you something warm to drink." Quote, Clara stood for a moment just outside the door, staring at the simple wooden cabin. Her hands shook, and it had nothing to do with the cold. The thought of stepping inside, of leaving behind the past for something new, was terrifying. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling before she could stop it. "Are you sure you want me here?" Quote, Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward and opened the door, holding it wide. "I wouldn't have brought you here if I wasn't sure." Quote, For the first time since he had paid her father's price, Clara felt something shift in her, a flicker of something that felt like safety, like possibility. She stepped inside the cabin, crossing the threshold and feeling the warmth of the fire wrap around her like a blanket. The room was simple but cozy, wooden walls, a sturdy table, a rocking chair by the fire, a small bed tucked in the corner with a quilt folded neatly at the foot. It was everything she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Eli followed her inside, shutting the door behind him. "I'll give you something hot," he said again, but this time his voice was softer, as though the weight of the world had lifted just a little. Clara sat down by the fire, her body aching with exhaustion she hadn't even realized she carried. Her eyes flickered to the small cradle tucked in the corner of the room. It was beautiful, carved flowers and delicate details that made her heart ache. She swallowed, her throat tight. "That's for—" She trailed off, unsure of how to finish the question. Eli looked over at the cradle, his expression softening. "For a baby," he said simply. "A long time ago I thought I might have one to put in it." He paused, then glanced at her. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She couldn't quite find the words to express the strange sadness that settled in her chest at the sight of that cradle. But Eli didn't seem to expect her to say anything. Instead, he took a deep breath, then crossed the room to the small stove, starting a fire in the hearth to heat up water. The quiet stretched between them again, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. It felt safe. Eli didn't push her to talk. He didn't try to fill the silence with words that didn't matter. He just moved around the room, doing simple things, like a man who knew exactly what needed to be done to make a place feel like home. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt like maybe, just maybe, this was a place she could belong. The next few days in the cabin passed in a blur of quiet routines. Clara found herself slowly adjusting to the rhythm of the place. Eli's calm presence, the crackling fire in the hearth, and the sounds of nature that filled the space between them. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful in a way she hadn't known for a long time. Every morning, Eli would rise early, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast. His simple ways were different from everything she'd known. No loud conversations, no endless expectations. He just did what needed to be done, and somehow, that was more than enough. Clara spent her days by the fire, cleaning what she could, organizing the small cabin. She still found herself staring at the cradle, her heart aching with a feeling she couldn't explain. She'd never imagined herself here, in this cabin, with this man, who had shown her nothing but kindness since the moment he'd bought her from her father. Eli didn't speak of her past. He didn't ask questions. And that was more than she'd expected. She had half expected to be treated like an object, her every move judged, scrutinized. But with Eli, there was no judgment, no pity. Just a quiet understanding she couldn't quite place. One evening, as the fire flickered low, Clara sat near the hearth, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar peace she'd found. Her hands rested on her stomach, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself think of the life growing inside her. The baby. It had been so easy to think of it as something that had happened to her, something she had no control over, something that had marked her forever. But now, in the warmth of the cabin, with Eli in the next room sharpening his tools for the day's work, Clara couldn't help but wonder if it was something more. Maybe the baby wasn't a curse after all. Maybe it was a new beginning. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Eli's boots on the wooden floor. He stood in the doorway, his face tired but soft, like a man who had seen hard days but carried them without complaint. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, his expression unreadable. "You're thinking too hard," he said, his voice low. Clara looked up, startled, then smiled a little. "I'm not sure I know how to think any other way," she admitted. Eli stepped further into the room and placed a mug of something warm on the table beside her. "Then let me help," he said, sitting down beside her, his weight settling the chair with a familiar creak. "Stop thinking for a while. Let me do the hard stuff." She wanted to protest, to tell him she was fine, that she didn't need anyone to take care of her. But the truth was, she had no idea what she was doing. She didn't know how to make this work. She didn't know how to be the woman Eli thought she was. Eli's gaze lingered on her face, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You're not alone, Clara, not anymore." The words landed heavier than she expected. She swallowed, looking down at the mug in front of her, feeling something well up inside her that she didn't want to acknowledge. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough. She wasn't sure what she was thanking him for. Perhaps it was for simply existing, for offering her a place in his world without asking for anything in return. He nodded, his hand brushing the edge of hers as he reached for his mug. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise. "I don't expect anything from you," Eli said quietly. "I never have. Just be here. That's all I'm asking." Clara stared at the fire, her fingers curling around the warmth of her mug. "I don't know if I know how to be here. You're doing fine." She didn't reply immediately. The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different. Not oppressive, not awkward, just quiet, like the world outside had stilled for a moment, holding its breath. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the wind outside howled through the trees, Eli stood up and moved to the cradle. He stood there for a moment, staring down at it, his face unreadable in the dim light. Clara watched him from her spot by the fire, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Finally, Eli turned to her, his voice soft. "I've been working on this for a long time," he said, almost to himself. "I guess I thought someday I'd have a baby to put in it, but maybe it's for someone else now." Clara's heart twisted painfully at the thought. She hadn't expected Eli to feel so strongly about the cradle. She hadn't expected him to care about something so small, something so fragile. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Eli turned to her, his expression gentle but firm. "You'd have done just fine, Clara. You're stronger than you think. And we'll figure this out. Together." Quote. She wanted to believe him, she really did. But the road ahead was uncertain, filled with fears and doubts she wasn't ready to face. The next few days were a blur of quiet routines, the rhythm of life in the mountains slowly sinking into her bones. Clara helped Eli when she could, cooking, cleaning, even learning to fix the small things that broke in the cabin. Every day she felt herself growing stronger, little by little. The baby kicked more now, a constant reminder of the life inside her. Eli had a way of making the hardest tasks seem manageable. He didn't rush her, didn't demand anything she wasn't ready to give. Slowly, as the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't thought possible. But there was still a lingering fear, a whisper in the back of her mind that told her none of this could last. What if she wasn't enough? What if her past was too heavy for Eli to carry? The winter months passed slowly in the cabin. The snow blanketed the earth outside, keeping the world frozen in its grasp. Inside, Eli and Clara settled into a quiet rhythm that, for the first time in a long time, felt like peace. Eli spent most of his days chopping wood, maintaining the small farm, and preparing for the inevitable spring. Clara spent her days by the fire, knitting, mending, and looking after the cabin. She wasn't sure if she was waiting for something to happen, some crisis, some challenge, or if, for the first time in her life, she was simply letting herself be still. Still, doubts lingered in her mind. The baby kicked more these days, its tiny movements reminding her that she wasn't alone. But the uncertainty of her past, of her father's betrayal, of the shame she carried, still haunted her. She wasn't sure if Eli could see it, if he could hear the whispers in her head telling her she didn't belong here, that she wasn't worthy of the life he was offering. But Eli never spoke of those things. He never asked her to explain her past, never pushed her to tell him what had happened. He was simply there, steady and sure. She didn't know how to handle it. One afternoon, as the snowstorm howled outside, Clara sat at the table, sipping tea. Eli was out chopping wood as usual. It had become his routine to leave early in the morning and return in the late afternoon, his hands rough with the work, his shoulders tired but never complaining. Clara looked out the window, watching the flakes dance through the air. She had always hated the cold. It reminded her of the winters spent in the valley, locked away in her father's house, alone and unwanted. But here, in the cabin, surrounded by Eli's quiet presence, it didn't feel as cold. She felt something shift inside her, a small but significant change. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. The baby kicked again, this time more forcefully, as if to remind her of its presence. Clara placed a hand on her stomach, a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know what kind of mother she would be. But, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. When Eli returned that evening, the sun already set behind the mountains. Clara had dinner waiting for him. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth. Eli walked in, his cheeks rosy from the cold, and gave her a small smile. "Smells good in here," he said, shedding his coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. Clara smiled, her heart fluttering slightly. It was a simple thing, this life they were building together, but it felt like the most real thing she'd ever known. Eli sat down at the table, and Clara set the stew before him. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. After a while, Eli leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice gentle. Clara looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding inside until that moment. The weight of everything, the baby, her past, her fears, had settled on her like a heavy blanket. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, "about the future, about what I'm going to do when the baby comes." Eli's gaze softened, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to do anything, Clara. Not yet. We'll figure it out together. I know it's not easy, but you're not alone in this." She squeezed his hand, feeling the sincerity in his touch. "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be enough. If I'll ever be the kind of mother I want to be. I don't know what I'm doing, Eli." Eli's grip tightened on her hand, his eyes steady. "You're already enough. You've already proven more than enough. The way you've taken care of this place, the way you've taken care of me, that's more than enough." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away quickly, trying to hide the emotions she felt threatening to spill over. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until he said them. Eli leaned forward, his voice low. "Clara, you've been through things that no one should have to go through. And yet, you're still here. You're still standing. That takes strength. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you." The words sank deep into her chest, and for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe them. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to try. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eli smiled and stood up, moving to the fire to add another log. He turned back to her, his face softened with something tender. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. You've already given me more than I could have ever asked for." Later that night, as they sat together by the fire, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The cabin was warm, the world outside quiet, and for the first time in a long time she wasn't afraid of what the future held. She leaned against Eli's shoulder, letting the silence envelop them. The baby kicked again, a soft reminder that life was still moving forward, still growing. "I think I'm starting to believe in this," she said quietly. Eli kissed the top of her head, his voice steady and sure. "I think you're already doing it, Clara. You're living it." Quote. And for the first time in a long while, Clara believed him. Spring came slowly to the mountain, the snow melting in trickles that turned into streams, cutting paths through the earth, running toward the distant river. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood and warmth, a constant presence that Clara had come to cherish. There was no rush anymore, no frantic sense that things were slipping through her fingers. The world outside still carried its harshness, but here, in this small cabin, there was peace. And in that peace, Clara had begun to rebuild herself. She had settled into her role, gradually, learning to trust the routines. The morning light through the window was different now. It was no longer a reminder of the days she had lost, but a promise of the future she could still shape. Eli had been patient with her, more patient than she had thought possible. And with each passing day, she felt herself becoming less of the broken girl who had arrived at his door, and more of the woman she was meant to be. The cabin was ready for the baby. Clara had spent the last few weeks preparing, washing clothes, hanging them by the fire to dry, making small adjustments to the nursery corner where the cradle stood. Eli had carved it for her. Every night, when he returned from the woods, tired and covered in the scent of pine and sweat, he would stop by the cradle and run his fingers over the smooth wood, as if he was waiting for something. Clara hadn't asked him about it again, but she'd watched him. It was strange, the way he seemed to care for the cradle, almost like it was a promise. And she didn't know how to explain the way it made her feel. One afternoon, as she sat by the fire, mending a torn piece of cloth, Eli came inside, shaking the snow from his boots. It had started to fall again, thick and heavy, the first real snow of winter. He looked at her, the firelight casting shadows across his face, and for a moment she thought he might say something. But instead, he simply smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes, and moved toward the stove. "Seems like the snow's not done with us," he said, his voice low but familiar. Clara smiled back. "It never is." The air between them had changed. It had shifted over time, and though neither of them had ever acknowledged it outright, there was something growing, something that felt like home. Eli moved quietly around the cabin, the way he always did. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence was constant, and it made the silence between them comfortable, even when they said nothing at all. It wasn't until he was seated at the table, pulling off his boots and setting them by the door, that he spoke again. "I was thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe we should go to town tomorrow. I know you've been wanting to get out, and the roads are clear now. It might do us both good." Clara paused, the needle in her hand halfway through the cloth. She hadn't thought about going to town in a long time. Part of her had wanted to stay hidden, safe in the bubble they'd created here, but another part of her, one she'd buried deep down, had wanted to see the world again, to breathe outside the confines of this cabin. "I haven't been to town since everything happened," she said softly, the words coming out more hesitant than she'd intended. "I don't know if I'm ready." Eli looked up from where he sat, his gaze steady but gentle. "You don't have to go. We can stay here as long as you need. But I think it might help to see things for what they are now, not what they were." Clara bit her lip, looking down at the cloth in her hands. It wasn't the fear of the town itself that held her back. It was the fear of seeing people again, of hearing their judgments, feeling their eyes on her. And the thought of facing her past, even from a distance, filled her with dread. But Eli was right. She had been running from it for too long. Maybe it was time to face the world again, to stop hiding behind the walls of the cabin, behind the comfort of their small life. "Okay," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll go with you, but only if we leave early and come back before the snow gets worse." Quote, Eli's smile was brief but genuine, and he nodded. "We'll go first thing. Just you and me." The next morning, after a quick breakfast, they saddled up Bessie and prepared to leave. Eli didn't say much as they rode down the mountain, the wind biting their cheeks, the snow swirling in the air. Clara felt the same tightness in her chest, the same nervousness that had plagued her whenever she thought about facing the world again. But as they descended into the valley, the world began to feel a little smaller, a little more manageable. When they arrived in town, it was quiet. The streets were empty, the buildings covered in a dusting of snow, and the townsfolk kept to their own business. It was almost as if they had forgotten the scene that had played out in the market square, as if the past had been buried by the snow. Eli helped her down from the horse and led her toward the general store. Clara couldn't help but notice the way people glanced at her. Quick, furtive looks that spoke of judgment, of gossip just beneath the surface. But it didn't matter. Not here. Not anymore. She wasn't the girl who had been sold in the market. She wasn't the girl who had been abandoned. "How about we grab some supplies?" Eli asked, his voice calm and easy. Clara nodded, grateful for the normalcy of it all. She hadn't realized how much she missed the simplicity of it, the quiet rhythm of everyday life. They walked into the store together, the warmth of the fire inside a welcome relief from the cold. Clara found herself scanning the shelves, picking up small things here and there, her hands steady now, her mind quiet. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. When they returned to the cabin later that afternoon, The snow had started to fall again, heavier this time. But the ride had done something to her. It had reminded her that the world outside was still there, still moving, and she was a part of it. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was living. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara looked at Eli, a soft smile on her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "For today." Eli met her gaze, his expression gentle. "No need to thank me. I'm just glad we're here." Clara nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe she wasn't as broken as she had once believed. Maybe, just maybe, she could start over. With Eli. With their child. "Maybe this is what I've been waiting for," she whispered, almost to herself. Eli's smile was small, but it was real. Maybe. The days grew longer, the snow beginning to retreat as the first signs of spring appeared in the valley. Clara found herself standing on the porch of the cabin more often, watching the way the land changed around them. The air had a warmth to it now, though the mountains still stood cold and unyielding in the distance. Each morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, she felt something new growing inside her, not just the baby, but a sense of belonging. Eli worked tirelessly, as he always did, cutting wood, mending the fences, preparing for the season ahead. But now, when he came back to the cabin at the end of the day, there was something different about him. He wasn't just the man who had saved her from a life of loneliness and pain. He was something more, someone she could trust, someone she could love. And Clara knew, with a certainty she had never felt before, that she was falling in love with him. She couldn't say it yet. She couldn't bring herself to voice the truth that had been in her heart for so long. But she knew it, deep down. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But together, they were building something worth holding on to. One afternoon, as the warmth of spring finally began to creep into the cabin, Clara stood by the fire, kneading dough for bread. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in thought. "You're quiet today." Eli's voice broke through her reverie. He was standing in the doorway, his shoulders broad from a day's work, his hair tousled by the wind. Clara smiled, though it felt a little nervous. "I was just thinking," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "About what?" Quote, "About us," she replied, without really thinking. The words were out before she could stop them, and she felt her heart skip a beat. She couldn't look at him, not now, not with the truth hanging between them like a fragile thread. Eli moved toward her slowly, his boots muffled on the wooden floor. He placed a hand on her shoulder, turning her gently to face him. His eyes were steady, calm, but there was something in them, something she couldn't quite name. "Us?" he asked, his voice low. Clara nodded, her heart pounding. She hadn't meant to say it like that, hadn't meant to put herself out there so completely. But now that she had, it felt right, felt like the only thing left to say. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Eli didn't speak right away. He just watched her, his gaze steady, like he was reading her every word, every movement. Finally, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to ease some of the tension in her chest. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he said softly. "I've been waiting for you to realize it." Quote. Clara blinked, her breath catching. "What do you mean?" Quote. Eli stepped closer, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "I've known, Clara. I've known for a while now, but I needed to be patient. I needed you to see it for yourself." Clara's chest tightened, her heart racing. "What if I'm not ready? What if I can't?" He cut her off gently, his voice firm but kind. "You're more than ready, and you've already given me more than I ever expected. You're here. You've chosen to be here. That's enough." Clara swallowed, tears threatening to spill. It wasn't easy, what he was offering. It wasn't easy to trust someone again, to believe that love was possible. But Eli had shown her something she had almost forgotten. Something real, something that didn't come with conditions, with expectations. "You don't have to be perfect, Clara," Eli said, his thumb brushing over her skin. "You just have to be you." She nodded, finally meeting his gaze. The words, simple and true, settled in her chest like a promise. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "I'm scared of messing this up, of failing." Eli smiled, his fingers gently cupping her chin. "You don't have to worry about that. We'll figure it out together. One day at a time." Clara's heart swelled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next storm to come. She was standing here, with him, ready to face whatever came next. "I want to try," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I want to try with you." Eli's smile widened, and he leaned down to kiss her gently on the forehead, a simple, perfect gesture that made her breath catch in her chest. "We'll take it slow," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But we'll do it right. And we'll do it together." The fire crackled in the hearth, the soft light dancing across the room. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, there was nothing but warmth. A warmth that was beginning to grow between them, a warmth that neither of them had ever known before. Clara looked up at Eli, her heart full of something she couldn't name. Maybe it was love, maybe it was trust, but whatever it was, it felt like home. "Let's make this a real home," she whispered, her voice steady now. "Together." Eli nodded, his eyes softening. Together. And for the first time, Clara truly believed it. She believed in the life they were building, in the future they were creating, and in the love that was growing between them.